My best friend moved into my house to help while I was sick. What she did next broke me. The day Adaeze moved into my house, she came with 2 suitcases, a pot of egusi soup, and a smile so wide I almost forgot every bad thing I had ever felt about being sick. I had been battling a kidney infection for 3 weeks. My body felt like someone had wrung it out like a wet cloth and left it to dry on the floor. I could not stand long enough to boil water. I could barely lift my phone without my arms trembling. My doctor had just given me the news that my kidneys were showing signs of early damage and that I needed complete rest, medication, strict diet, and absolutely zero stress. Zero stress, as if life had ever once cooperated with that instruction. I was alone. My husband, Emeka, was traveling for work. A 3-month contract in Abuja that we had both agreed was too important to cancel. We had no children yet. My mother was in the village, too old to make the journey to Lagos. My sisters were scattered across the country. And then Adaeze called. She said, "Chinyere, I am coming. Don't argue with me. I am coming." And I cried on the phone. I actually cried. Because she was the kind of friend who said things like that and meant them. We had been friends since secondary school, 22 years of knowing each other's secrets, wiping each other's tears, dancing at each other's weddings, and showing up without being asked. At least, that was what I believed. She arrived on a Saturday morning with enough energy to power the whole of Lagos. She reorganized my kitchen before noon. She bought fresh tomatoes, crayfish, and ediocha from the market and made a soup so good I wept a little eating it. She woke up before me every day to make sure my medications were ready with a glass of water. She drove me to the hospital for my weekly checkups. She rubbed warm coconut oil on my back when the pain was too much at night. For the first 2 weeks, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. My husband called every evening. I told him about how Adaeze was caring for me, how she had taken over the cooking and the cleaning, how she was sleeping in the guest room and never once complaining. Emeka sounded relieved. He said, "God bless that woman. Tell her I said thank you." I told her. She smiled and waved her hand like it was nothing. It was in the 3rd week that things began to shift. I noticed it the way you notice a smell that shouldn't be there. Subtle at first, something your brain keeps dismissing until the day it's too strong to ignore. It started with the phone calls. Adaeze had always been social. Back in school, her phone was always ringing. So when I heard her talking in low tones in the kitchen at night, I didn't think much of it. But then I noticed she would stop talking the moment she heard me moving. She would come back into the room with that same wide smile and ask if I needed anything. I would say no. She would look at me just a second too long before going back to whatever she was doing. Then came the afternoon I woke up from a nap and heard her voice clearly from the corridor. I was not eavesdropping. I was half asleep and the words floated to me through the door. She was laughing, that bright, light laugh she reserved for people she was trying to impress. And then she said, she doesn't know anything. She's just lying in bed all day. She can barely walk." I stayed very still. "Yes," she continued, "he calls every evening around 8. She goes to sleep early because of the medications, so after 8:30, the house is completely quiet." Something cold moved through my chest. I told myself I was misunderstanding, that I was feverish, that the medications were making me paranoid. I told myself there were 100 explanations for what I had just heard, and that the worst one was probably not true. I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. Or tried to. The next evening, Emeka did not call at 8. He called at 9:15, and when he answered, his voice sounded strange, slightly distant, slightly careful, the way a person sounds when they are trying to sound normal. I asked him if everything was fine. He said yes. I asked him if he had been busy. He said the project was moving fast. I said okay. We talked for 12 minutes and then he said he needed to go. That was the shortest call we had ever had. I lay in the darkness after that for a long time. By the 4th week, I had started doing something I was ashamed of. I started watching. Not in an aggressive way, I was too sick for that, but in the quiet, careful way of a woman whose body is weak, but whose instincts are screaming. I noticed that Adaeze always offered to charge my phone for me and would bring it back with the screen off. At first, I thought nothing of it. But one night, she forgot to turn the screen back off, and when I picked it up, the last app open was not my messaging app, it was my recent calls. She had been looking through my recent calls. I said nothing. I put the phone down, I stared at the ceiling and breathed slowly. In, out, in, out. A sick woman has a particular kind of clarity. When your body strips away everything else, the noise, the social performance, the exhaustion of normal living, what is left is very sharp. You see things you would normally talk yourself out of. You feel things you would normally bury under business. I began to remember small things. The way she had asked me in the first week, so gently, so casually, whether Emeka traveled often. The way she had asked me what time he usually called. The way she had paused once when I mentioned something he said to me. Just a half-second pause, like she was processing something. The way she always seemed to have her phone face down when I walked into a room. I thought about the night she had offered to take my phone to charge it in the living room because she said the charging cable in my bedroom made a buzzing sound that could disturb my sleep. I had been so grateful. I had been so stupid. I called Emeka the next morning, early, before she was awake, 6:30. He sounded surprised to hear from me so early and then worried. He asked if I was okay. I said I was. I said I just missed him. He said he missed me too, and then I said something that was not really a question but sounded like one. I said, Adaeze tells me you two have been talking. There was a pause. It was a small pause, a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, a woman who has been married for 8 years and knows the sound of her husband's voice better than she knows her own heartbeat, heard everything she needed to hear. He said, "Oh, yeah, she called once to give me an update on how you were doing. I meant to mention it." I said, "Of course." He said, "Are you sure you're okay?" I said, "Yes, I need to rest. I'll call you tonight." I hung up the phone and sat very still in my bed. She had his number. She had saved his number. She had looked through my phone to get his number, and then she had called him, and he had not mentioned it, and she had not mentioned it, and they had both looked at me every day since then with their full faces and said nothing. I did not cry. I was surprised by that. I thought I would cry. But instead, I felt something hard settle into the center of my chest, something very cold and very clear. I got up that morning for the first time in weeks without waiting for Adaeze to bring me my medications. I shuffled to the bathroom, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. My face was thin. My eyes were tired. I looked like a woman who had been surviving, not living. I had a decision to make. I could confront her, I could throw her out, I could call Emeka and scream every truth I had built up in my chest like fire. I could call her mother, Mama Adaeze, who had known me since I was 14 and who would be devastated. I could fall apart completely. Or I could watch. I could be patient. I could wait for a truth that was solid enough to stand on, not just suspicion and pauses and a sick woman's instincts. I chose to wait, not because I was weak, because I knew Adaeze. I knew how she operated. She had always been someone who got bored with secrets. She could never hold them for long. If something was happening, she would not be able to stop it from showing. So I waited. That same afternoon, I told her I was feeling much better and that I wanted to try sitting in the living room for a while. She was delighted. She helped me to the couch, fluffed pillows around me, made me tea. She sat across from me, and we talked the way we used to, about nothing, about everything, about our secondary school days and the teachers who hated us and the boys we had liked. For a moment, watching her laugh, I almost convinced myself I was wrong. I almost told myself to let it go, that I was sick and paranoid and that this woman loved me. And then her phone buzzed on the table between us. She reached for it quickly, a little too quickly, and turned it face down, but not before I saw the screen, not before I saw the name. It said Emeka. She had saved my husband's name in her phone. My husband had called her. The room did not spin. Time did not slow down the way they describe in books. Everything stayed exactly where it was. The tea, the cushions, the afternoon light coming through the curtains, and I simply looked at her face and watched her compose it into something neutral. She said, "Sorry, let me just quickly check this." She took the phone and walked to the kitchen. I heard nothing. She came back 3 minutes later with her phone in her pocket and a small smile on her face. She sat down and picked up the thread of our conversation as though nothing had happened. She asked me if I remember the name of the chemistry teacher who failed us both in GSS 2. I told her I couldn't remember. I smiled. Inside, I was burning. That night, I waited until I heard the steady sound of her breathing through the guest room door. Then I picked up my own phone and I called my husband. Not at the usual time, not at 8, at 11:30, when he would not be expecting it. He answered on the third ring. He sounded awake. He sounded like he had been awake for a while. I said, "Emeka, she's calling you." He did not say who. He did not say what are you talking about. He said Chi and then stopped. That single syllable, my nickname, said in that voice with that stop, broke something in me that I had been carefully holding together for days. I said, "How long?" He said, "Nothing has happened. I need you to know that. Nothing has happened." I said, "I did not ask you what happened. I asked you how long." He was quiet. Then he said, "She reached out when you first got sick. She was sending me updates." And then he stopped. And then it became more than updates. What does that mean? He exhaled. He exhaled. She was flirting. I told her to stop. She didn't. I should have told you. I should have called it out immediately. I didn't because I didn't want to upset you while you were sick, and I thought I could manage it myself, and I was wrong. I sat with that for a moment. Is that the whole truth? Yes. Look me in the eyes and tell me that. Chi, I can't look you in the eyes right now. I'm in Abuja. Then hear me say this. If I find out later that you are lying to me, there will be nothing left. Do you understand me? He said, "I understand you, and I am not lying." I hung up. I sat in the dark for a very long time. I thought about 22 years. I thought about her sitting beside me in the hospital the day I had a miscarriage 2 years into my marriage, holding my hand without speaking, just being there. I thought about the night I called her crying because Emeka and I had a fight so bad I had packed a bag, and she drove 40 minutes in the rain to come sit with me. I thought about every moment of real friendship I had collected over 2 decades and the weight of all of it. And then I thought about her face when she turned that phone face down, the speed of her hand, the calculation behind her eyes. She had moved into my house, she had held my medications, she had rubbed my back, and while she did all of it, she was reaching toward my husband with the other hand. There is a particular evil in kindness that is not kindness, in care that has an agenda underneath it, in a friend who watches you sleep and waits for you to be weak enough to move on. I thought about what my grandmother used to say. She would sit on her low wooden stool behind the kitchen and say in Igbo, "The snake that lives in your house is more dangerous than the one in the bush because it knows where you sleep." I had let the snake set up a bed in my guest room and iron her clothes in my house and call my husband from my kitchen. In the morning, I woke up early again. I dressed properly for the first time in weeks, slowly, painfully, but completely. I wore a wrapper and a blouse. I combed my hair. I sat in the parlor. When Adeze came out of the guest room at 7 and saw me sitting there, dressed and upright, something moved across her face, something she couldn't quite control. For just a moment, she looked not guilty exactly, more like startled, like she had forgotten in the middle of everything else she was doing that I was still a full person. She recovered quickly. She smiled and said, "Ah, T, you are looking better today. How are you feeling?" I said, "Sit down." She heard something in my voice. Her smile flickered but held. She sat. I said, "I know about the calls." She opened her mouth. I said, "Do not lie to me. We have been friends for 22 years.
If you lie to me right now, that is the thing I will never forgive. Not the calls, the lie. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, I didn't do anything wrong. I looked at her. She said, I was just talking to him, giving him updates. You were sick, someone had to keep him informed. I said, you saved his name in your phone. He called you last night, and whatever you are calling what you were doing, you hid it from me for weeks. Chi, you're being paranoid. You are sick. The medication. Do not, I said quietly. Do not do that. She stopped. You came into my house, I said. You cooked my food. You gave me my medications. And every day while I was lying in that bed thinking you were the most faithful friend I had ever had, you were building something with my husband behind my back. What do you call that, Adeze? What is the name for that? She looked at me for a long moment, and then something shifted in her face. The performance cracked. She said, you don't appreciate him. I felt the air leave the room. She said, you don't know what you have. He's lonely, Chi. You are always sick, always tired. You haven't given him children, and get out of my house. She kept talking. I'm not saying I did the right thing, but someone has to say it. You are so busy being sick and being the victim that you don't see what is right in front of you. Get out of my house right now. Chi, if you say my name one more time, I said, and my voice was so steady it scared even me, I will throw everything you own out of that window. Get your bags, get out. She got up. She went to the guest room. I heard drawers opening and closing, hangers rattling, the zip of a suitcase, the thud of a bag hitting the floor. I sat in the parlor and did not move. My hands were folded in my lap, my back was straight, my whole body hot. The kidney infection did not care about drama, but I sat straight and still and I did not move. She came out 20 minutes later with both suitcases. She stopped in the parlor entrance. Her face was complicated, something between defiance and something else, something softer and more broken that I might have responded to once before today. She said, you don't appreciate him. I said, but you did. She left. I heard the front door close. I heard her car start. I heard it drive away.
And then I sat in my house alone, with my kidney infection and my tea, and the morning light coming through the curtains, and I cried. Not because I was weak, not because I had lost. I cried because 22 years is a long time, because grief is not only for the dead. Because sometimes the most devastating losses are the ones where the other person is still alive, still walking around in the world, and you simply cannot reach them anymore. I cried for the girl she had been, for the friend she had been, for the version of her I had trusted more than almost anyone. And then I dried my face and called my husband. He picked up before the first ring finished. I said, she's gone. He said, Chi. I said, I need you to come home. There was a pause. Then, I'll book a flight today. I said, good. And Emeka, we need to talk about all of it when you get here. Everything. Don't come home thinking I've forgiven what you let happen. I haven't. But I want to hear your face say the things your voice said last night. He said, I'll be there. The next 3 days before he arrived were the quietest days of my entire adult life. I cooked for myself. Small things, soft things, nothing complicated. I took my medications, I slept and woke and slept again. I prayed. I walked slowly around the compound in the evenings because the doctor had said gentle movement would help. I thought about everything. I thought about what it means to be a woman whose body is failing her and who is therefore expected to be invisible. To be grateful for care even when the care comes with hands that are stealing from you. I thought about how sickness makes you vulnerable in ways that the healthy never fully understand. You stop being a full person in people's minds. You become a patient, a burden,
a before and after. I thought about Adaize's face when she said, "You don't appreciate him." The certainty in it, the righteousness, as though my illness had disqualified me from my own marriage, as though 22 years of friendship gave her the right to decide what I deserved. She had not come to help me, or maybe she had in the beginning. Maybe the first pot of soup was real, the first week was real, the back rubs were real. But somewhere in those first days, something in her had shifted. Something old and deep that perhaps she had been carrying long before I got sick. And she had stayed, not for me, but for the access, for the proximity, for the slow, careful building of something she had decided she was owed. That is the thing about betrayal that the old stories always understand better than we do. It is never a sudden thing. It moves the way water moves, finding the small cracks, filling them quietly, patient and cold, until the whole wall comes down. Emeka arrived on a Thursday evening. He looked tired and smaller than I remembered, which surprised me because he was a big man. He stood at the door with his bag in his hand, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between remorse and fear. Not fear of me exactly. Fear of himself, of what he had allowed. I let him in. I made him sit. I made us both tea. We talked for 4 hours. I asked every question I needed to ask, and he answered every one without flinching. I believed most of what he said. I did not believe all of it, but I believed enough to know that what had happened was not what it could have become, and that the difference between those two things was still worth fighting for. I told him what I had heard from the corridor. I told him about the phone. I told him about the name she had saved in her contacts. I told him about the morning I woke up early and called him and heard his silence before his words. He listened to all of it without trying to defend himself. That was the first good sign. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, "She called me the day before you confronted her. She said you had become suspicious and that maybe I should come home to manage the situation." I stared at him. He said, "Those were her exact words, manage the situation." I thought about that for a long time afterwards. Manage the situation. As though I was a problem to be handled, as though my sickness and my suspicion and my existence in my own marriage were logistics to be organized by two people who had decided between them that I was no longer the center of my own story. I had been lying in a bed in my own house, too weak to stand for long, and somewhere in another room someone was teaching the world to think of me as a problem. That night, Emeka and I sat together in the bedroom for the first time in months. We did not pretend everything was fine. We sat with the damage between us like an object on the bed, solid and present and something we would have to decide what to do with. He said, "I am sorry, not just for the calls, for not telling you, for letting it go as far as it did, for leaving you alone and sick and not being the one here to protect you. I am sorry for all of it." I said, "You didn't protect me. That is the part I will take the longest to get over. Not her. Her I understand. She was always envious of something. I just didn't know of what. But you knew something was wrong and you chose to manage it yourself instead of telling me. You left me in the dark, in my own house, in my own marriage." He didn't argue. He said, "You are right." I said, "You will sleep in the guest room tonight. Not because I'm punishing you, because I need space to think, and I can't think with you next to me." He said, "Okay." He took his pillow and he went to the guest room, the same guest room where Adaize had slept. And I lay in my bed alone and looked at the ceiling for a long time before sleep finally came. The weeks that followed were difficult in a different way from the sickness. The kidney infection was straightforward. We went to a counselor, a woman named Dr. Okonkwo, who had an office in Victoria Island with dark wooden furniture and small windows that let in thin slices of afternoon light. We went every 2 weeks. We talked about things I had never said out loud, and Emeka talked about things I had not known were inside him. It was uncomfortable and necessary and slow. My kidneys gradually improved. By the second month after Adaiza left, I was cooking again, walking without pain, returning to the full shape of myself. I did not contact Adaiza. She sent 2 messages in the first week. The first said, "I am sorry for the things I said." The second said, "Please, Chi, don't throw away 22 years. I did not reply to either of them. Her mother called me, Mama Adaiza, a round, warm woman who smelled of ugba and shea butter and who had fed me from her pot more times than I could count. She called me crying and said she did not know what her daughter had done, but that she was ashamed. She asked me to find it in my heart. I said, "Mama, I love you. This is not about you." She said, "I know, my daughter, I know." I did not blame the mother for the daughter, but I could not unsee what I had seen. Some of the women in my church found out, the way things always find their way around small communities, and I received a range of reactions that told me more about people than I ever wanted to know. Some women said, "You should have thrown her out yourself that same night." Some women said, "Are you sure you are not exaggerating?" Some women said, "Thank God nothing actually happened." Some women said, "What were you expecting, leaving a beautiful man alone while you were sick?" That last category of women I looked at for a long time. I looked at them the way you look at something you are trying to understand and finally stop trying to understand, because understanding it would require becoming something you do not want to be. My mother, when I finally told her the full story on the phone, was quiet for a very long time. Then she said in Igbo, "A woman who comes into your house to steal must first convince you she's only there to clean." And she said, "God, who was watching while you were sleeping, was not sleeping himself." That is the thing I held on to in the month that followed. That even when I was the weakest I had ever been, flat on my back in a dark room, too exhausted to watch my own life, something was watching it for me. Something I couldn't name had moved through the darkness of that corridor and carried her words to me. Something had made me wake up early and call my husband. Something had timed the buzz of that phone on the table between us perfectly, precisely, so I could see the name on the screen. Or maybe it was not something supernatural. Maybe it was simply me, my body exhausted and reduced to its most essential self, with all the noise stripped away, hearing and seeing and knowing things that the healthy, busy, distracted version of me might have missed for years. Sickness is a terrible teacher, but an honest one. It removes every comfort and every pretense and leaves you with only what is real. What was real? My husband had failed me and was trying to repair that failure slowly and imperfectly. What was real? My best friend of 22 years had revealed herself to be someone I had never fully known. What was real? I was stronger than I had understood myself to be. What was real? I sat in my own parlor, sick and thin and in pain, and sent a grown woman out of my house with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly where her line is. What was real? I was still here. By the time the year was turning, I was fully recovered. My follow-up test came back clean. My kidneys were holding. My doctor said I was one of the more resilient cases she had seen. I thanked her and thought about what that word meant, resilient, not as a compliment, but as a description, something that can be bent without breaking.
The last thing I want to say is this, and I want to say it to the person watching who has been here the entire time. The person who knows something is wrong in their own life and keeps telling themselves they are imagining it. the person whose instincts are screaming and whose love is telling them to be quiet. You are not imagining it. Your body knows things before your mind agrees to know them. The discomfort you feel in a room where something is off is not paranoia. The way your chest tightens when a name appears somewhere it shouldn't, that is not weakness, that is information. You do not need to be healthy and strong to be right. You do not need to be standing upright and unbroken to know your own life. I was sick. I was medicated. I was thin and exhausted and barely able to walk to the bathroom. And I was right. There is a proverb from the old women of my village that my grandmother said so often it became like wallpaper in my childhood home. So familiar I stopped hearing it until I needed it. She would say, "The hen that knows her compound will not be lost even in the dark." I know my compound. I know my life. I know where I have placed my love and what I have built and who has a place in it and who does not. And when someone, even someone who has known me for 22 years, even someone who shared my pot and my secrets and my history, when someone decides to test that, to enter my house under the cover of care and reach into the center of my life with grabbing hands, they will find out what I am made of. Not iron, not stone, something harder than both, something that heals.
Hello, welcome to the Quiet Blue Stories. I believe that you enjoy the story that you just finished watching now. If you enjoy it, I want you to like and subscribe and share this video so that you can always be updated once we upload our next video. Thank you very much. Bye bye.